Welcome to the Unlocked Podcast, a podcast where we decode human performance one gene at a time. I'm Tony, and this series isn't just about science. It's about unlocking the hidden power you carry in your biology so you can train smarter, live longer, and activate what most people think is fixed. We're going to talk about genes, healing, mental clarity, recovery, and even where science and soul start to meet. But we're starting with the foundation. Because most people don't know what DNA really is or how much control they actually have. Hello, everyone. I just want to say congratulations to everyone who's been listening. We are officially at episode 10, and that is a need for celebration, but the job is not done. I have another podcast coming your way, so thank you for listening. Thank you for your continued support, and I hope that I give you knowledge that is not only applicable, but just teaches you a little bit about your body so you can heal and upgrade your body to the maximum level of performance. That being said, today we're talking about APOE. If you heard that name before, it was probably in the context of Alzheimer's disease, and usually in a way that makes the gene sound like a verdict. That is part of the reason this conversation gets distorted so fast. APOE is not just a gene people talk about when they're afraid. It's a real working part of human biology with a specific job, and that job helps explain why it's so important in the first place. APOE stands for apolipoprotein E. Again, that's apolipoprotein E. In simple terms, it helps package and transport lipids, which are fats and fat-like molecules the body uses for structure, signaling, and maintenance. That includes cholesterol. In the bloodstream, apolipoprotein E helps move the materials through lipoproteins. In the brain, that's important because the brain is a lipid-rich organ. Nerve cells depend on lipids to maintain their membranes, support connections, and handle repair. So before APOE ever became famous in disease conversations, it was already important because it was helping move raw material through a system that constantly needed upkeep. That is the first piece we're holding on to. APOE is not only a risk gene people mention in passing, it is part of a transport and maintenance system. And once you understand that, the rest of the conversation starts to make more sense, because if you change a transport protein that affects how your body and brain handle lipids, you may also change how the system responds over time under stress, aging, and repair demand. There are 3 common versions or alleles of APOE. There's APOE2, APOE3, and APOE4. You inherit one from each biological parent, so people carry one of 6 common genotype combinations. APOE3 is the most common form and is usually treated as the reference pattern. APOE2 is generally associated with lower Alzheimer risk compared with APOE3, while APOE4 is associated with higher risk for late onset Alzheimer's disease. That is the broad framing. But the word that is the most important here is risk. Risk is not the same thing as certainty, and that distinction is where a lot of public discussion falls apart. When people hear higher risk, they often translate it into future guaranteed. Genetics usually doesn't work that way. A risk gene changes probability. It does not automatically dictate outcome. The National Institute on Aging notes that inheriting APOE epsilon 4 increases risk, but some people with APOE epsilon 4 allele never develop Alzheimer's disease. And you're probably wondering, what is epsilon? And epsilon just stands for the Greek letter E, which is the 5th letter in the Greek alphabet. And the way you're supposed to pronounce, or you will see this particular gene on your report, would be APOE epsilon 2, APOE epsilon 4, just so you guys have a better understanding. I noticed that I was saying 2, 3, and 4. It's really epsilon 2 or epsilon 3 or epsilon 4, if that makes sense. So moving along, the National Institute on Aging also notes that having 2 copies is associated with higher risk than having 1. So even before we go deeper, the cleanest way to say this is that APOE4 is important, sometimes a great deal, but it's not a death sentence written in stone. What makes APOE important is not just the headline, that it's linked to Alzheimer's. It's the biology underneath that headline. APOE is connected to lipid handling, and in Alzheimer's research, it's tied to how the brain handles amyloid over time. Amyloid refers to protein fragments, especially amyloid beta, that collects or can collect into plaques in the brain, one of the major biological features associated with Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't mean amyloid alone explains everything, but it does help explain why changes in APOE get so much attention in discussion of long-term brain aging. Alzheimer's does not usually appear overnight. The biology builds slowly over years, and genes like APOE may influence the terrain long before symptoms show up. So the more useful question is not whether APOE4 is bad, quote unquote. The better question is how different versions of APOE, or how many different versions, may shape the long arc of brain maintenance and vulnerability as a person ages. That also helps explain why APOE should not be lumped into the same category as the rarer genes associated with inherited early onset Alzheimer's disease. Genes such as APP, PSEN1, and PSEN2 are involved in rare forms of early onset disease and behave more like causative mutations in affected families. APOE is different. It is a common risk gene in the general population, and it modifies likelihood rather than functioning like a simple on and off switch for disease. That distinction is one of the most important in the entire conversation, because once people blur those categories, they start reacting to APOE as if it means something more absolute than it actually does. Another reason APOE has been getting more attention is that the field has become more direct about people who inherit two APO epsilon 4 copies. In 2024, a Nature Medicine paper argued that APOE4 homozygosity, meaning inheriting two APOE4 copies, may represent a distinct genetic form of Alzheimer's disease. That does not mean every person with two APOE4 copies will develop Alzheimer's, but it does mean researchers are treating that genotype as more than a mild increase in odds. It may reflect a more specific biological pattern that deserves its own prevention and clinical framework. There's another layer here as well, because even risk is not always identical across all populations. The effect linked to APOE4 can vary with ancestry and genetic background around the APOE region. That is one reason genetic results need interpretation instead of emotional overreaction. And as a genetic fitness coach, I always want to explain to my clients, hey, look, this doesn't mean anything crazy. It just means that you have a likelihood of not getting as much results as a person who doesn't have this gene or does have the gene, or vice versa. And remember, a person is never just a lab value. A gene sits inside ancestry, physiology, environment, and lived biology. And when people skip that context, they end up flattening something that is far more nuanced. APOE has also moved beyond being only a future risk conversation. It now matters in some present-day treatment decisions. Newer anti-amyloid therapies such as lecanemab and donanemab carry warnings about ARIA, short for amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. Lecanemab and donanemab are Alzheimer treatments. That term refers to changes seen on brain imaging, usually swelling or small areas of bleeding that can happen during treatment. FDA labeling notes that APOE4 homozygotes have a higher incidence of ARIA with these therapies. So this gene is no longer only something people see on genetics reports and wonder about years later. In some cases, it can shape how treatment risk is discussed right now. So what do you actually do with APOE information if it shows up in your life or on your lab report? The first thing is to resist the two most common bad reactions. One, panic. The other is dismissal. Neither of those help. If someone learns they carry APOE4, the most useful move is not to spiral, and is not to pretend the results mean nothing. So if the genes show up on a report, don't panic. It's perspective. The better move is to get practical. Start with your vascular health, because the brain depends on blood flow and vessel health every single day. Look at blood pressure. Look at movement. look at whether your lifestyle is helping circulation or slowly working against it. Then look at sleep. Sleep is not just rest. It is one of the main windows where the brain resets, clears waste, and supports repair. If sleep is constantly broken, shortened, or pushed aside, that is not a small detail in a brain health conversation. Next, you're going to want to look at metabolic health, blood sugar regulation, insulin resistant, body composition, and inflammation all shape the environment the brain has to function inside. APOE does not replace those factors. Again, it sits inside them. Next, you're going to want to look at activity. Exercise is not a guarantee against disease, and we should not speak about it that way, but regular physical activity supports blood flow, metabolic health, and brain function, which makes it part of a small, long-term strategy. And finally, look at context. Is this simply a risk conversation? Is it a family history conversation? Is it a treatment conversation? Those are very different situations, and they should not be blended together. So for this protocol, it's not fix the gene. The protocol is support the terrain the gene is operating inside. So in conclusion, APOE shouldn't be a fear gene. It's a clue. It tells us that brain health is tied to transport, repair, timing, and long-term biology. It reminds us that genes are rarely interesting only because of the diseases attached to them. They are interesting because of the systems they sit inside. And once you start seeing that, genetics stop feeling like fate and starts feeling more like an interpretation. So, the way we always end the podcast, guys, remember, your biology listens. Live like it.